Liam, the floor is yours.
Great. Can everyone see my screen? All right. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So my name is Dr. Liam Satchell. I'm based at the University of Winchester at the Centre for Forensic and Investigative Psychology. And my research has a lot to do with methodological reform in applied forensic psychology topics. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how we focus on how we communicate our results and how we interact with practitioners. And I've been around deception research and similar topics for nearly 10 years now. And I've spent a lot of time trying to talk to end users and working with end users about how they make sense of our research. And I have some concerns or some thoughts about how we might methodologically be approaching doing this research. But I also think we need to think a lot more about how we're talking to end users about our research. And today I want to talk to you about some work that I recently published in the ERG journal about how we communicate our findings to practitioners and what we can reflect on in that communication and conversation with end users. So your classic lie detection study, you get a group of participants, you allocate them to one of two different conditions, and you tell them to either lie or tell the truth. You look to see some sort of pattern of difference in their responses, and there's various things you might be looking at here, amount of details or certain types of behaviors, but you look to see how those groups in general differ from each other. And then you draw some sort of conclusion from this. There was a difference between the groups, and perhaps we can use this information for detecting lies. There are ways in which we can tweak this paradigm, but I think we all know from reading the literature, if you're familiar with the journals, this is the standard paradigm that you're most familiar with, how it comes across. There's nothing inherently wrong with this if you're taking a between subjects approach to looking at this question. I do recommend colleagues check out some of the interesting ideas and ideographic approaches that people like Timothy Luke have been proposing recently as a way of thinking about this different framework, thinking about approaching this in a slightly different way. But this core method kind of gives you a difference on do lie tellers generally give you different information to truth tellers. This in itself is a classic approach to doing experimental research, and there's nothing particularly unusual about it. One of the strange things that we do is we then try and take statistical differences that we might allude to as researchers and apply those into practical differences. Now, we can have a long conversation about where statistical difference comes from, but most of the statistical difference precedent is relatively arbitrary. Our reasons for why we conclude P is less than 0.05 is significant, or what we consider a large Cohen's d to be this week, or what an interesting base factor might be, are all generally arbitrary and set by precedent and not really of practical interest. They're based on theoretical interest. What's the general sample of how the population might respond to this rather than what might be useful to execute in practice? And then we kind of get to this odd position, and I've taken some direct quotes here from some papers. This is not picking on these papers. You actually see it in many places. But people start talking about how the findings of these mean difference studies tell us things about the discrimination between truth and lies, or how you might have a diagnostic cue to deception based on differences that you observe in a particular sample and there being a mean difference. The problem is that these statistical tests are not really designed to demonstrate discrimination. They're not really designed to show diagnostic cues. They're not even really designed to separate groups. They're interested in theoretical differences in, is there general differences between those groups, which on a large enough scale might be theoretically interesting. And this is not really the case when a practitioner has one case in front of them at one point in time. And I want to sort of illustrate what I mean by this. So take a particular example of a finding. This is a relatively small sample size, but a classic sort of finding that you'll find in literature of something that is statistically significant and has a reasonable Cohen's d difference between groups. And you see here that the lie tellers score slightly higher than truth tellers on whatever the thing is that we're talking about here. This finding does tell us that in general, lie tellers engage with this behavior more than truth tellers. But there's some things that this general mean difference approach is kind of hiding. If we sort of flip this on its side and have a look at it as two histograms, you can see there on the left, you've got the distribution of lie-telling responses, and on the right, you've got the distribution of truth-telling responses. When you have data like this, with this kind of mean difference that is statistically significant with a reasonable effect size, there is still a considerable number of cases inside your data that are overlapping. Considerable number of people inside your data set present the same. In fact, in this particular context, in the study where we asked our participants to lie or tell the truth, and let's say we looked at number of details or some sort of behavioral cue, actually what you see is 80% of the time they present identically to each other. 80% of the participants within that data set, you couldn't really allocate them into being a lie or a truth teller based on their particular performance. So put yourself in the perspective of a practitioner. You've been told that there's a difference between these groups of participants. there's a reasonable effect size. But in practice, 80% of the time, you're not going to have any strong cues to what's actually going on in that particular case as to whether that person might be telling the truth or lying. And in fact, where you do get differences, they're at the extreme ends of both types of performance and both types of elicitation. Your extremely different liar is the only time that you're going to notice it. Your extremely different truth teller is the only time you're really going to notice it. So this idea of being diagnostic about liars or truth tellers based on this kind of finding isn't particularly true. I couldn't give you this cue and tell you this is a true cue to lie telling, because really only about 10% of the time a liar is going to perform in the way that we might suggest. What's quite scary when you start looking at data like this is that you have to have really big differences in statistical terms before you start getting limited overlap. If you're interested in being able to tell practitioners, look for this thing, and it will tell you if someone is lying, and even if you want that to only happen in 13% of cases, you need a Cohen's d of 3. You need an unknowably large effect size in any kind of research. This is like drinking a poison versus drinking a sugary drink sort of differences and outcomes, right? There's nothing in deception detection that really looks like this. You need differences of this size for there to be a relatively small overlap in those distributions. And here we start to get an idea of what a diagnostic cue might even look like. This is where you have a diagnostic cue. Here is where you have differences listed between groups. But this is so rare in itself. And actually, this should give us a moment to sort of pause and reflect on the fact that this is how large your differences have to be in order for there to be a diagnostic cue between groups. One of the problems with focusing on mean difference effects is that this is hidden, but there are also other effects that are kind of hidden inside our data that are really useful for practitioners. So take a look at this example. This example here gives you a Cohen's d of 0. This is not a statistically significant difference between these two groups. But that's because their means are exactly the same. But the difference in what you're seeing behaviorally is massive. Whatever you're doing in this intervention, your liars are giving you a homogeneous effect. Your liars are all doing the same thing, but your truth tellers are all over the place. So you've done something here to strategically coerce all your liars into behaving in the exact same way. And actually, your truth tellers are all over the shop. So actually, you do have a pretty good diagnostic cue in here. But you wouldn't know this. There's probably decades of research that has identified effects like this and just pushed it away because it's not statistically different on a t-test, or it's not got a nice Cohen's d value, or it's got a Cohen's d of 0 here. So actually, by not looking at the distributions in our data, we're not seeing things like this. It was in fact looking at data sets which weren't published, so I won't say whose work it was, but I was working with some colleagues who had data like this, had results like this, and were saying there's nothing going on in their data, yet I was seeing stuff when I was actually looking at the raw distribution. Now, the way in which to think about this stuff, the way in which to engage with this sort of information is, first of all, to think about what this means as researchers. We should be looking at, whenever we're focused on mean differences, I still interested in mean differences, so that we still need to consider variability and standard deviations as very important. We also need to think about the fact that often the common statistical tools that we all learn and acquire may not fit all solutions and all the things we want to use. Yes, we've learned Cohen's d, yes, we've learned p-values, but actually there are other ways in which we can be transparent about communicating our findings to practitioners. The overlap coefficient, those percentage overlaps I've been discussing with you, you can compute that with statistical software, and I've written a tutorial of that in my OAK paper, but it's not the only lens to do this. And there's issues as well with looking for overlap between groups. But this is kind of an appeal to say when you're looking at your data, you're looking at the things that are going on inside it, looking at those distributions is particularly important. And it's not just looking for, on average, are my lies or truth tellers different? Because your practitioner really can't do that much with an average person behaving differently, when most of the cases in front of them are presenting similarly, and they aren't going to be discriminable. The other thing to give advice to practitioners is they should be asking questions about the variability in the data, but also get them involved with the way in which you want to analyze and discuss your data. What do they want to understand? How do they want to be communicated to about these findings? Because actually telling them, on average, a certain percentage of the time at the extreme end, only a few people differ on this behavior is quite a quick way to sort of shortcut their beliefs in what you're trying to communicate. Telling practitioners p-values and Cohen's d doesn't tell them about realistically what's going on. But if I'm talking about systematically retraining intelligence officers or police officers to get them better at deception detection, I really wouldn't be particularly comfortable in doing so unless I had a good pitch to them and say, this is when this is being diagnostic, this is when you're separating people out. So overlap coefficients are one way to look at this, but I think there are other ways too. And my main point here is that when you are doing data in the traditional data collection process that we see a lot in deception detection literature, you should be thinking about how you're going to communicate this to outside groups, what the relevance is for practice and how we handle this data statistically. And we should also be thinking more broadly about how we reform our methodologies and the way we go about collecting data and try and draw conclusions from this whenever we're trying to talk to an end user audience. There we go, a presentation about statistics and theories of research design, but with a practitioner focus in mind. Thank you very much.